Um, but I now want to go to an interview, actually, I did a little bit earlier on today with the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. And of course, much of what I've just talked to Jess and Maria about, I talked to her about. I began by asking her to describe her personal feelings about the murder of Sarah Everard.
Well, I think, Robert, first of all, the tragic circumstances around Sarah's death are just, there are just no words really for it. And as I've said publicly in my statement in the Commons, I think we can all relate to this primarily because, you know, she, like so many of us, she was on her way home. She was walking home. It's part of the freedoms that we all have, but you know, we take, I'd love to say we take for granted our safety, but actually when you're a woman or a young girl walking home late at night or early evening or from school or from work, you just don't take that for granted. You really don't. And that is why this has just hit, you know, so many, I think, emotional points for all of us, because all of us can relate to what has happened in that way. You know, how we've all walked home on our own with a mobile phone, with keys in our hands. We're all very self-conscious and self-aware of the risks that women face. And that's just tragic. You know, we've all been there. We have all been there. And that is why I think this has become just so raw and symbolic for so many people. But alongside that, I do want to emphasise and say that, you know, there is a lot that has moved on, I think, in society in terms of safety of women, but also the safety of all citizens on our streets. And, you know, there's good work that takes place. You know, when you look at, for example, the crime survey, how people feel around crime, perceptions of crime. So we've got to build upon that. We really have to build upon that. But, and I emphasise this, we do also have to respond to very legitimate concerns around safety and security of women and girls on the streets of our country.
Now, I'm going to get on to those legitimate concerns, as you say. But you also said that you were upset when you saw some of the treatment of women on Clapham Common during the vigil by the police. What did you mean by that? Well,
the footage itself, and I speak frequently, actually, about footage of policing and all sorts of things that we see on social media. The upsetting factor around some of the footage we saw was, let's not forget, throughout the day, we'd seen people come together in actually a very personal and most respectful way to pay tribute to Sarah Everard. And that had been taking place for approximately 8 hours throughout the day. And some of the most beautiful floral tributes were being left. People were paying their respects. And I think all of us, you know, even those that did not go to the bandstand in Clapham, we found other ways in which we could respectfully pay, you know, some tribute to Sarah Everard, lighting candles at home, for example. And then, of course, later on in the evening, we saw really unpleasant footage, obviously, of, you know, officers and people at the vigil, you know, all sorts of things that basically raised concern. And it was upsetting to see after what had been a very respectful day, people paying tribute and showing their respect. And that is effectively what I referred to. So the police inside, the interaction, and how, you know, we ended up seeing people who attended the vigil basically being arrested, you know, plenty of officers around. Got no doubt, and I've spoken about this since, you know, in terms of the Metropolitan Police commissioning a report, getting Her Majesty's Inspectorate in. Could things have been done differently?
I mean, the thing that I suppose I was surprised by is why couldn't the police have simply, you know, organised for, you know, those, in a sense, a procession of people at a social distance, 2 by 2, coming in, you know, throughout the night. What, you know, it did seem to be a fairly straightforward police mistake.
Well, look, I'm not going to get into the recriminations and sort of pass judgment in terms of, you know, what could have been done, primarily because the Metropolitan Police, as we know, had spent time on Friday working with the organisers, speaking to the organisers as well. So the point is now, off the back of what has happened, we will get an independent review stroke report from Her Majesty's Inspectorate. And of course, there could be lessons learned from that. So I think we should not all rush to judgment, and we should absolutely wait and see now, you know, what the findings are that come out from the inspectorate.
I mean, but just very briefly, because I want to move on to other very important issues. You have already said, though, that you don't think there's a case for Cressida Dick to resign, but you've also said we've got to wait for the report. Those two statements don't seem to me to be consistent.
Well, they are consistent because, first of all, I'm not going to prejudge a report and also the operational handling of what happened on Saturday. The other point to make about the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, I work with the Commissioner on all sorts of policing issues, and actually to run and jump to the conclusion that someone should have to resign off the back of what we saw on Saturday without seeing the full report is completely wrong. So I think, again, we should not. It's wrong to end up in this sort of prejudging phase before we actually know the full facts. And not only that, the Commissioner has been clear that she welcomes the review that I have commissioned or that has been commissioned. And, we'll be very, very, we'll wait for that review and work with us on the findings as they materialise, because that's the right process to take on this.
Now, there are a number of absolutely horrifying statistics around rape. 98.5% of rape reports to police don't lead to prosecution. Vast majority of sexual assaults don't even go to the police. How are we as a nation, but how are you going to deal with this crisis?
So there are so many factors around sexual harassment, sexual violence and rape. Rape is a very, very good example, actually, of how we are looking at bringing in changes to the end-to-end approach. And I appreciate that is a terrible phrase to use, but for viewers, that basically means from the minute that a woman comes forward, engages with the police, right through to charging decisions, or actually even before charging decisions, giving over evidence, giving statements, how women are treated within that process, and then as investigations progress, charging decisions and how cases come to court. There is a lot that happens within that process. We have a rape review taking place right now in government. And in fact, we are working with many individuals, organisations who are contributing to that review, who themselves have a lot of experience, some very difficult experience, but experiences that we as a government and not just ministers, but for example, the police and the CPS can also learn from. The courts can learn from that, and we need to change. There's a lot that we need to change.
Keir Starmer today offered a cross-party approach, said he wanted to come in, actually with one of our guests, Jess Phillips, to come and see you, come in and see the Prime Minister. Will you accept that invitation?
I work with everybody. And as somebody that's chaired the all-party parliamentary group on victims of crime, I've got strong views, in terms of how we must do more, must do better. I myself have led a lot of the victims work, Victims Code, for example, Victims Bill work in the past as well. So we will work with everybody.
So the Prime Minister said today that he felt there was absolutely no place in Britain for casual and everyday sexism. You've got a 13-year-old boy, I think. How do you teach him about the right way to treat women with respect?
Well, I think there's a lot. And as a mother, I feel very strongly about this, in terms of how we bring up our children. And one of the basic principles is respect to each other. That is respect irrespective of our gender, how we speak to each other and how we treat girls. With my son, good example at school, clearly, but being very cognizant and aware of the behaviours to one another. And it does definitely start with our children. It does start also without prejudging. There's too much prejudging, I think, that takes place. But also there are many, many debates around, sexism, stereotyping, all those types of things, but making sure that fundamentally, certainly in my household and with my son, and I know that there are many, many mothers across the country with young sons and boys who will all relate to this. It's that principle of respect that really matters. Now,
absolutely. Now, I'm afraid last question, we're out of time, sadly, but if one of your male colleagues said about you that the best way to manage you is just to pat you on the bottom and send you on your way, what would you say to that male colleague?
Well, I would not accept that at all. It's fair to say that I would say to my colleague, if that ever happened, that is just simply unacceptable. We've just had we've just spoken about treating each other with respect. That is simply not respectful. It's appalling.
So I probably ought to tell you that is what the Prime Minister said when he left his job as editor of The Spectator about his female boss, Kimberly Quinn. So do you want to tell the Prime Minister now that he shouldn't have said that?
I mean, I wouldn't hesitate. And believe you me, I'm here in my capacity as a government minister, as Home Secretary. I've worked in all sorts of other professional sectors, and I've worked in the city, and I've heard all sorts of things said about female colleagues, which is simply unacceptable. I'm not the type of person, I think it's pretty well known, to sort of sit back and accept, really quite disparaging and derogatory remarks. And I myself have been subject to things of that nature in the past, and I just don't think that's acceptable. And I would speak out against that.
Home Secretary, I'm delighted to hear that. And it's, as ever, it's a joy to speak to you. Please come back soon.
Thank you.
All the best.